Shalom and blessings. Since Rosh Hashanah, I hope you've been enjoying our studies in the book of Genesis, as we've looked together and wrestled with the Torah portion each week. Now, this week is the final portion of Genesis. This is also the last of our full, free weekly videos. If you have enjoyed our studies and found them to be beneficial, enlightening, and a fresh Hebraic look at the scriptures, then I invite you to join us at Torah Plus. At Torah Plus, which is a subscription service, we will continue looking at the scriptures each week. In time, there will be additional material, discussions, word studies, and content that you can engage with on the Torah Plus platform. If you have the passion and desire to help and bless the ministry to Jewish people, then Torah Plus is a great way to do that. Your small support encourages and blesses the team at CMJ. And in return, you'll receive some Hebraic perspectives on the roots of the Christian faith, which is rarely taught anywhere else. So I invite you to come and explore Torah Plus with us. A link will be provided, and we will begin looking at the book of Exodus as the Lord initiates his redemptive story through the sacred history of Israel. Shalom and God's peace until then.
Shalom, this is Aaron. Good to see you. Today we're wrestling with the Torah portion called Vayechi, which means "and he lived." And it starts in Genesis 47:28 till the end. This actually is the last Torah portion of the first book of the Bible. Quite a journey so far. I hope you've enjoyed it with me. I've really enjoyed it. And today I'd like to look at the first couple of chapters of this Torah portion. This portion includes the incredible blessings by Jacob to his children in Genesis 49. But that really does require a more in-depth discussion. And we would like to do that later. But for right now, I'd like to turn our attention to some of the things that we can learn from the life of Jacob. Because that's what it's called. Vayechi Yaakov. And Jacob lived. Where did he live? He lived in the land of Egypt, in the country or the county of Goshen, and they had possessions there. They grew, they multiplied exceedingly. Now, in the ancient days, you didn't read the Bible because you didn't have one. So you, as an ancient people, we actually heard the text, and what you hear really makes you think, makes you dig deeper into the text. I want to talk about the verse of the end of last week's Torah portion, which is verse 27 of chapter 47, because it says, "So Israel lived in the land of Egypt." Now, if you heard that, Israel lived in the land of Egypt, what comes to your mind? What would you be thinking? Well, your first thought would be, they shouldn't be there. I can understand how the Torah portion started, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt. But to hear Israel lived in the land of Egypt? No. Israel's supposed to live in the land of Israel. What's Israel doing in Egypt, I hear you ask? And what we have here is how Egypt and Israel are going to become bound together in the sacred history of the universe per se. Israel is going to be incubated inside the land of Egypt. This is where Israel's going to grow as a people. They're not going to grow as a nation in the land of Canaan. They're going to have to exit Egypt, which we will talk about in the next book of the Bible. And they'll have to journey to the land, which we talk about in the book of Numbers. And then they're going to have to go into the land, and they're going to be prepped by Moses to do so in the book of Deuteronomy. And along the way, they're going to be called to be a holy people, which is the book of Leviticus. But when you hear that Israel lived in the land of Egypt, you begin to think, why? Why couldn't they live in Canaan? Why do we have to go down into Egypt? Now, we've already had some backstory. We've already had Joseph being sold to his brothers, and what people had thought was bad, God had turned to good, and God had used Joseph to literally save the world at that time period from this incredible famine. But now Jacob, who has been called by God to live in and dwell in the land, and he left the land for a moment in time, and he went to Haran, where he found himself some wives, and he became a people group, 12 sons, and he became quite wealthy. He returned, and he had been doing his job. He had been responding to his calling to be fruitful and multiply, and to live and dwell in the land. But now he had to go to Egypt. And so what do we learn from that? We learn that despite having his calling to be in the land of Israel, sometimes as you go through life, you don't always achieve your calling instantly. Sometimes you actually have to go through a trial. Perhaps you have to sometimes go through some suffering. Perhaps you have to go through some development. Perhaps you have to learn something about yourself or do some studies. It's not that God calls you to the mission field and immediately you're off. Instead, you might have to prepare. You might have to prepare your budget. You might have to prepare your supporters and get your prayer support. You might have to do some training, go learn a language. Well, we all have to do that, but that never takes away from the calling. So even though Israel's in Egypt, even though Jacob is in Egypt, that never once takes away from the calling of God's people to be in the land. What does Paul say in Romans? The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. That's in Romans 11. And the context of that is he is talking about the Jewish people. And that despite the way we might view how they're doing, they still have a calling to be a light to the nations. They still have a calling to be dwelling in the land. It's an incredible challenge for the church today. And many of the church would disagree with what I've just said. And they might not see the text in the same way that I or perhaps we do, but it is there. God's calling is irrevocable, and that includes to you and to me, so that you and I have the same calling, and despite what's going on in our life, that calling has never gone away. What you're called to do today, you will be called to do tomorrow. God does not change like that. He is not utilitarian. He has not made a mistake. There is only one plan A. There is no plan B. So Jacob lives in the land of Egypt 17 years. Why does the Bible record that specific date? I mean, the numbers in the Bible are there for a reason. This is sacred history. There are no superfluous words in the text. And here we also see another Hebraic concept that beginnings and endings are constantly they're running in a pattern, and they're intricately related to each other. Jacob looked after Joseph for 17 years. He was able to care for his son, raise his son, teach his son, and at the age of 17, that's when Joseph had his dreams, and where his brothers put him in the pit, and when he is then sold to the Ishmaelites. And then the rest of Jacob's life, he lives without his son until the end, when he's 130, and he migrates down to Egypt, and then Joseph gets to care for his father for 17 years. So Jacob cared for Joseph for 17 years, Joseph cares for Jacob for 17 years. Israel grew and incubated in the land of Egypt, and that's where Israel starts. And when we see in the prophets of Isaiah 19, there will be a highway that will lead from Egypt to Assyria. Egypt will be part of the future of Israel. Egypt will be part of the last days. So never dismiss beginnings, and because they will always play a part of your endings. So Jacob stays in the land of Egypt for 17 years, and he lives, as the Bible says here, for 147 years. And I've been having a conversation recently that God had said after the flood that man's life would be 120 years. And yet it still takes quite some time for that actually to come to fruition. Abraham lives for 175 years. Jacob here is 147 years. when does 120 come to be cemented? The first person who lives for 120 years is, guess who? Moses. Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, will announce to Israel that today I am 120, which means it's his birthday. He's 120 years today. He also turns around and says, and tomorrow there's no more tomorrow for me. Today I die. And he dies at 120. And so he is the penultimate human prior to Jesus. And so it's, again, why Jesus is often cast as the new Moses in every aspect. Moses he lives the 120 years that God had proclaimed. But it takes a while to get there. Now that's an interesting thought for all of us, that sometimes we often, in our modern world and our modern culture, which is so instantaneous, and we demand everything immediately, we need high-speed internet, we only watch 2-minute TikTok videos, no one has any patience to sit through anything that takes longer than 5 minutes. As soon as we hit traffic, we complain. We're a very, very impatient people now, unfortunately, when one of the fruits of the Spirit is, of course, patience. Even in God's plans, things take time. God said, man will only live for 120, but it's not until Moses that actually happens. Jacob is called to dwell in the land of Canaan. And he does for a brief moment, but then he's taken out of it. And he won't get back into it until long after his death. And so his descendants are actually going to fulfill his calling. And so for ourselves and our callings and our ministries and the way that we approach life or engage with life, it's not instantaneous. Sometimes we have to wait and be patient. Sometimes we have to do some learning. Sometimes we have to go through a trial or our own little Egypt until we actually can finally do our calling. Sometimes our callings or the mission or the way we see the world operating and working will only be achieved by our children. And is that okay? And hopefully the answer is yes. Hopefully the answer is, you know what? Yes, I will work and prepare knowing that the next generation will fulfill the aims and callings that are on my house, that are on my life, that are in as part of the kingdom of heaven. And Jacob had to get there. He lived for 147 years. Now, when Jewish people hear that text, he lived. It was a full life. He had things that went wrong. Okay, his children did not do well for him. They slaughtered the people of Shechem, Simeon and Levi. Reuben, his firstborn, did something very inappropriate with one of his concubines. Joseph, he thought Joseph was dead. His heart was broken, and then there was that tension that he thought he might also lose Benjamin. His wife, his beloved wife Rachel, had died in childbirth, and he had to bury her in Bethlehem, where her tomb is to this day. You can go and visit it. But at the same time, he ends well in taken care of in the luxury of Egypt with his son, the second most powerful person in the entire known world at the time. So his life was full, good and bad. Can we accept that? Can we also accept the good with the bad? It's not always easy. But each of our trials, each of the things that hurt us, also shape us as part of our character and make us who we are. And even though Jacob lived and dwelt in Egypt, and he himself didn't get to the Holy Land, although his descendants did, God still calls himself, I am the God of Jacob. When you get to the Psalms, he often says, I am the God of Jacob. He identifies even in that. And so that's a good learning thing for us. So in verse 29, Jacob seems to know when the time drew near that he might die. And the name Jacob and the name Israel begin to oscillate. Sometimes he's called Israel, sometimes he's called Jacob, and people have written many a research paper and or book or of commentary about why this happened, and the answer is no one knows. Okay, it's the sounds that you hear are really important. Not necessarily always what you read, but you hear that Israel knew that his life was up. So he calls his son Joseph, not any of his other children. Okay, he doesn't call Reuben, doesn't call Judah, doesn't call Dan or Naphtali, calls Joseph and says, I need you to make an oath with me. Now, it's one of the characteristics of the heroes of God, the patriarchs, the characters of the Bible, that they know when their life is going to expire. They know when their soul is going to be required of them. Sometimes that's a blessing, sometimes it's not. But for the heroes of God, that's one of their characteristics, one of their special abilities. And they get themselves ready, and which is a good lesson for all of us. Be prepared. There's a rabbinic commentary where the students of Rabbi, I think it's Akiva, they ask him, Rabbi, when should we repent? And Rabbi Akiva very craftily says, one day before you die. When will we die? Always be prepared. But for him, for Joseph, or for Jacob, he calls Joseph and he makes him give an oath. And they do a very interesting ceremony where it says that he places his hand under his thigh. This is what happened to Abraham. When Abraham was also approaching his death, he summoned his servant Eliezer of Damascus and said, put your hand under my thigh and go find a wife for Isaac. So something happens prior to death. Like, you do not do this ceremony usually when you're fit and healthy. And you do this swearing ceremony, and they make an oath, and they bind each other to almost like a contract. When you get to the New Testament, Yeshua grabs his disciples together and he says, when it's time to make oaths, you could just imagine the disciples getting panicky, going, oh my gosh, do we have to put our hands under our thighs? Yeshua says, no, let your yes be yes and your no be no. While this is in the Bible, this is part of sacred history, this is now no longer the tradition. This is not how you bind oaths to each other or how you make vows. And I know that we have texts in the New Testament where Yeshua says, don't make vows. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Just so you know, that doesn't mean literally don't make vows, because anyone who's married has made a vow. Okay, you actually have stood in front of God and in front of some clergyman, usually, usually in front of witnesses, and you said, I vow to marry this person and to be faithful to this person. So we do make vows. When people dedicate their babies or baptize their babies, they make vows. I promise to bring this little one up in the values of the Lord and teach them the Lord. So we do that. So not making vows is not literally what's being said in the New Testament, but the ceremony that's around it is being finished or dispensed with, and so now we don't do those kinds of things. But Jacob makes his son promise that he will not be buried in Egypt, but he will go and be in the Machpelah, in the cave at Hebron, and where Abraham and Isaac are buried. And Joseph swears to do this, but of course Joseph also dies in Egypt. This agreement, this oath, is only going to be carried out by the descendants hundreds of years later. And so we sometimes think that in our day and age things work so fast, but for God things take time. And is that okay? Is that actually okay for us to do? Can we go about the kingdom of heaven? Can we go about the work of the Lord? And if it doesn't finish in our lifetime, are we okay? Is it enough to hear the Lord say, well done, good and faithful servant? And the answer should be yes. And if that's true, wow, what an incredible burden that's been lifted from our shoulders when you need to trust the Lord to get something done. But Jacob does prepare. He does prepare, and he does make his son swear, I will not finish being buried in this land. I'll be buried in the land of Canaan, the land of Israel with my fathers. Does it really matter, though, where you're buried? I mean, is burial that essential? Like, what happens if you get cremated? What happens to people who died at sea? What does it actually mean? Well, in Jewish tradition, you actually resurrect where you're buried. So burial is incredibly important. And in our culture, we have a hints of that still to this day. There are people who want to be buried next to their wives or their families in graves that are very close together. Why not? I mean, you're dead, aren't you in heaven? What do you care? Well, it is important. When people get cremated, we often want to be scattered our ashes in certain places. So place is actually quite important. Even in Revelation, it'll say that in the judgment day, the sea will give up its dead. But if you're buried at sea, guess what happens to your body? It kind of gets eaten by the fish. And so what exactly is being resurrected? But in Jewish tradition and in the New Testament, there is the implication that you reappear on the day of resurrection in locations of where you were interned. So it could be quite important. And it was certainly important to the patriarchs. And it was certainly important to sacred history. And the early church, which was Jewish, got to remember all the early believers in Yeshua were all Jews, they incorporate this tradition too. So we inherit it as well. At the beginning of chapter 48, we now see something interesting in terms of blessings again. It says that it came to pass after these things that Joseph was told, "Indeed, your father is sick," and so he took with him his 2 sons. So this time Joseph is now bringing his children to his father, so their grandfather, and probably for a blessing. And just as each Abraham would give blessings, and Isaac would give blessings, and Jacob had usurped the blessing, it's now Jacob's turn to start blessing people. And it says this. Now remember, in the ancient world, you didn't read the text, you heard it. So it says, "Indeed, your father is sick," so he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh, Menashe in Hebrew, and Ephraim or Ephraim. Manasseh and Ephraim, in that order, because Manasseh is the oldest and Ephraim is the youngest. And Jacob was told, "Look, your son Joseph is coming to you," and Israel strengthened himself and sat up on his bed. So again, Yaakov, Yisrael, the names change, they blend, they're the one person. It's quite interesting when you hear it. Why the change? Don't know. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty has appeared to me at Luz," which was, today we call it Beit El, but in the book of Genesis, it's known by its original name, which was Luz. Okay, and that's always the tension. Is Luz Jerusalem, or the name of the place of Temple Mountain, or is it the little settlement that's just towards the north of Jerusalem? Today it's called Beit El, or the house of God. So the Lord appeared to Jacob. That's where he wrestled with that angel, and he had the dream of the ladder in the land of Canaan. And he blessed me. And he said, "Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make you a multitude of people, and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession." But now we find ourselves, our hero Jacob, lying in Egypt. And yet he is still passing on a future promise, which has not happened for him. He was in the land of Canaan, and now he had to journey here because of a famine. But he says that, this is what God told me. God told me that this was going to happen. I would be fruitful. I have got 12 sons, and I would eventually inherit this land. So I believe I'm coming back. Okay, I'm coming back, and we will return to Israel. Now your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to Egypt, they're mine, just like Reuben and Simeon are mine. Now what's interesting here is Joseph brought Manasseh and Ephraim, because that's the order of birth, Manasseh and Ephraim. Jacob says of his kids, Reuben and Simeon, and that's the order of birth. Reuben was firstborn, Simeon was second. But when he looks at Joseph's sons, he switches the order. He says Ephraim and Manasseh. Now why would he do such a thing? Because this is the continuing the tradition where God chooses the youngest, not the oldest. When Abraham had kids, it was Isaac who was the child of promise, not Ishmael, even though he was firstborn. When Jacob had Esau, when Isaac had Esau and Jacob, Jacob is the one that gets the promise and the blessing, not not Esau. And so Jacob has a pattern that the youngest are always the ones that are chosen. And so he knows this. And so he takes Ephraim and Manasseh, or Manasseh and Ephraim, to himself and says, these sons are now mine. And then he crosses them over. Joseph even tries to move his hands into the right order, but Jacob says, no, I know what I'm doing. Okay, the youngest, okay, is going to get the blessing. In the New Testament, we see Paul say to Timothy, don't let people disparage you because of your youth. You know, so often we want children to just be children and not let them become young adults. We often don't give our young people the opportunities for them to become men, and that's actually a real shame. But here, you know, in the Bible, young adults are truly that thing. They are young adults and counted as adults. And so Ephraim is an adult. Manasseh, even though he's the oldest, is actually going to have to be not of lesser importance, but allow Ephraim to flourish. And what's going to happen to Ephraim, I hear you ask? Well, when they come into the Holy Land and they divvy up their property, Manasseh will get a double portion. He will get two parts of territory. He'll get a part of the territory on the west bank of the Jordan River, and he'll get a part of the territory on the east bank of the Jordan River in present-day Jordan. Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh will dwell there. But Ephraim will have something incredibly special that none of the other tribes will have. And Ephraim will have a settlement inside it called Shiloh, and that's where the tabernacle will live. That's where God will dwell in the tribes of Israel for 369 years. If anybody has the opportunity to go to the Holy Land and go to Israel, I highly recommend going to ancient Shiloh and seeing the area where the tabernacle was. It's a fantastic archaeological site. But Ephraim will be important. And so Ephraim and Judah will be the two tribes in which God will dwell. And perhaps that's the reason why in the prophets you often see that it is Judah and Ephraim are the two sticks that become one. The prophets often talk about these two tribes and these two special locations for the presence of the Lord. And lastly, when in Jewish tradition, in modern day Jewish tradition, when you have Kabbalat Shabbat, or the Sabbath evening meal, a father will always bless his children. He'll bless his wife with a delightful reading of Proverbs 31. He'll bless his children, the sons and the daughters. And the blessing for the sons is always this. May the Lord make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. May God bind you to the commonwealth of Israel, because these were half Jewish. Their father was Hebrew, this is true, but their mother was the daughter of Potiphar. She's an Egyptian. So they're half. But now Jacob is saying, no, you're being grafted in. I know that this is one of my sons, Joseph, but you are now coming in. So the 12 tribes of Israel suddenly become the 13 tribes of Israel, right? Well, actually the 14 tribes of Israel. Because you've got the original 12, and you add 2 more, and you end up with this. So it's a very powerful moment that, brothers and sisters, we are grafted in to the commonwealth of Israel. This is what Paul does again in the book of Romans, where he's reminding Jewish people that you are part of the inheritance. You are part of the promise. Even though when it's happening, they're in Egypt, and their descendants will have to be the ones that leave, and be the ones that will have to go into and claim the Holy Land under Joshua. But we have this privilege too of joining the Commonwealth of Israel and being grafted in, not replacing, but becoming a part of the plans of God. And even if that takes time, and that's okay. So lots there to wrestle with and think about in the Torah portion. I hope you have suitably enjoyed our discussion. I look forward to seeing you or hearing with you next week when we get into the book of Exodus.